Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 1970 Yamaha Enduro. It is powered by a two-stroke 125cc engine, and for its age, it looks to be in fantastic condition. Most of the parts are here and undamaged. Both the tires actually hold air, so I don't think it's going to take a whole lot of work to get this running again. That said, it has been a few years since this has run. I'm told by the owner it has been in storage for some time. And even when he had it last running, it did have fuel problems. And I'm sure that hasn't gotten any better because there is a bit of fuel in the tank. And thankfully, the tank isn't in bad shape, but the smell of that fuel is pretty bad. So, yeah, fuel system for sure is going to have some issues on this bike. So the goal today is to get this machine back up and running again. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. All right, so first things first, let's check the oil, make sure we have some. Yeah, we have oil. It smells good. Does not smell like it's fuel contaminated. Let's just double check. Yeah, that oil level looks pretty much perfect. All right, so let's check the compression next. I have kicked the bike over. It feels like there is compression, but let's put a number to it. It seems a little bit easy to kick over, and an engine like this needs at least 90 psi to run. Ideally that would be closer to 120 psi. And this one's pretty unique too. This is a single cylinder engine, but the head has two spark plugs and only one coil, so you can't fire both plugs at the same time. My understanding is that this was actually for an optional compression release valve. But without that, you need to plug the hole, and now you have an extra plug. All right, keep an eye on the gauge. We want to see at least 90 psi, ideally 120 or better. All right, throttle's open. Beautiful. Looks like we're at 120 psi, maybe just a tiny bit under, but that is good. So we definitely have enough compression for the bike to run. So compression checks out. I think we'll check spark next. But one thing I did notice while doing the compression test is that the throttle, although it's not stuck, it's very slow to return. So potentially the plate on the carburetor might be a little bit gummed up, but I think more likely we might have issues with the cable itself. It's pretty loose in there and appears to be broken as well. So we will take a closer look at that in a little bit. But for now, let's see if we have spark. So let's check the boot first. It's kind of loose on the wire, and that could cause issues with spark. So let's make sure that, that we put it on tight, but even before that, let's make sure we see some wire. And not a whole lot there, so I'm going to trim that back just a bit to get some fresh wire. All right, that's good. And I'm going to test the boot just for continuity. You know, sometimes they do fail internally. A lot of times there's a resistor in there that occasionally can go bad. So let's check that out. So we've set this up to test the resistance. And if this boot has a resistor in it, usually you would see between 5 and 10,000 ohms. And in this case, we're at 6.8 thousand. So the boot is good. So we'll get that back on. Make sure it's tight. It just screws into that wire. All right, that feels good. So we'll get the plug in, and I'm going to kill the lights. And I'm also going to use this tester as well. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to see if there's spark. Right now there's a solid red light, but if we have spark, it should change to green, which is the middle light right there. And we'll kick it over a few times. Nope, no spark. So there is an ignition switch on the other side. Let me just turn it to the other direction. And no, there is no spark. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have any spark. So this bike, being a 1970, could have points and condenser for the ignition system, but we also have a battery. And bikes like this with a battery may also use the battery to energize the coil rather than the points and condenser. So, you know, before we dig in too deep chasing this issue, I think we should at least put a battery in and check for spark, and hopefully it'll come back. But I am a little concerned because there are a bunch of disconnected wires in various places. So before just throwing a battery in there and hoping for the best, you know, I think I am going to get probably the tank out of the way. That'll give us a little bit better view of the wire harness so that we can figure out if any of these disconnected wires are going to be an issue, you know, as it relates to spark. Anyway, let's get the tank out of the way. I was just trying to figure out how the tank comes off, and it doesn't actually look like there's any hardware to hold it in. You know, I think it's the seat when it closes that holds it in and kind of locks it in place. So that's going to make it pretty easy to remove. So let's get the fuel line disconnected. And while we're at it, we'll check for flow. See if that valve is any good on the fuel tank. All right, so right now the fuel valve's off. Let's turn it on. And the fuel's pretty low, so it might not be high enough. So let's turn it to reserve. And no flow. So potentially we're clogged up. I know the fuel level isn't super high either, so yeah, we'll come back to that. Let's get the tank out of the way for now. So by the battery, we have a black wire that's definitely the ground. It's connected right there. We have a white wire that doesn't go anywhere, so that's a bit concerning. And we do have what looks to be a brown and a green that just disappear into the harness. And then over here we have a red, a blue, two browns. And this one, it looks white, but it also has a green tint. And it's a pretty beefy wire, so I'm not sure where that goes. And this one, pretty sure it's the horn, at least one of the wires, but I'm not sure where the other one would be. All right, it is the next night. I had to step away from this. You know, the wiring wasn't making a whole lot of sense, so I had to do a little bit of research. You know, supposedly this bike was running a few years ago, but given the state of the wiring, you know, I was kind of doubting that at all. But after doing some research, I think I've made sense of most of this. You know, the first mystery being these two wires right here. You know, I did find another video of someone taking one of these bikes apart, and on his bike, these wires were not connected either. So my best guess is that these are for the left and right turn signals, which this bike doesn't have. Now, I don't know if it had it originally. You know, the thing that threw me is that we do have a turn signal switch right here. And, you know, that makes me believe that this bike may have had turn signals at one point. But ultimately, I think it was an option. You know, back in 1970, turn signals were not required. So potentially we just had the wiring for it, and that actually never existed on this bike. So I don't think we have any issues there. You know, as far as the battery goes, a black wire is definitely the ground, and I'm pretty sure this was used for the hot wire on the battery. And after finding a wiring diagram, it appears that the red wire right here is what actually needs power to kind of bring this thing to life. So this cable, you know, if I plug it in right there, it is pretty much exactly the right length, you know, to reach over to the battery. So I think that will get us up and going, but that still doesn't explain all these wires right here. So, you know, after looking at the wiring diagram a little more, it seems like this has a starter. They actually call it a dynamo. And the way it works is that the power is fed in to the dynamo. It's actually the stator as well. So, you know, when you feed power in, it actually cranks the engine. And once the engine's running, it becomes a generator to charge the battery. So I asked the owner if this had electric start, and he said no. At least he didn't think so. It never had one. And we actually don't have an ignition switch right here. So, you know, he is not the original owner. So I'm thinking someone may have bypassed that at some point, because according to the parts diagrams, there should actually be a starter solenoid right here. You know, this big beefy wire goes down to the dynamo. That should crank the engine. And then on the other big stud on the missing solenoid should actually go to the battery. And the red wire, that would just tap into the power feed from the battery. And these two right here, I believe, are what would power the coil on the solenoid. So I don't have the correct solenoid, but I do have one from a tractor that I think will at least allow us to test out our theory here. So before I wire this all in, I do want to test these wires and just make sure they are what I think they are, including this one right here. All right, so we'll get this connected to the negative. And we'll also run a lead over from battery positive over to this red wire. So no sparks. Let's turn the switch on. And yeah, actually we have the neutral light. So that's off, on. If I turn the switch one click further, that should be the light. Yep. Light works. What about high beams? Nope. Low beams. So no change there. Let's see if we have a tail light. Yeah, we have a tail light. And let's see if the brake light works. And actually, we can't really test that right now. So, yeah, we're making progress. So it seems like the bike now has power, and the coil should also have power now. So let's kick it over again and see if we have spark. All right, let's try this again now that we have some power going to the coil. So same test as last time, but hopefully this time we see some spark on the tip of that plug. So let's turn the engine over. Oh yeah, and there we go. We've got nice, strong spark. on the tip of that plug. And the tester says the same. We're blinking green. So awesome. We've got compression and we've got spark. All right, so we're getting closer. You know, we theoretically should run once we add fuel into the mix, but before I move on, I do want to test the starter. I want to see if that is viable, and if it is, we'll wire something up there to take advantage of that. And I also want to verify that this is the horn, like I think it is. All right, so we know the red wire gives us spark and a bunch of other things. Let's test this wire right here. When this is energized, the engine should crank. So let's try that. Awesome. So it cranks. Obviously it's pulling a lot of current, so we're going to have to probably use a little bit beefier wire than that one. But as it stands, it would appear that the starter is good. All right, so I'm going to use a test light just to verify what these wires are. And I'm going to connect one end of the test light just to the engine. So that should be negative. And if we find a positive source of power, you know, the test light should light up. So right now the ignition is off. And if we probe the brown wire, we get nothing. But when I turn it on, we get power. So that tells me we have 12 volts right there. And that means this other wire must be the trigger, likely a switched ground with the missing switch. So I don't think we're going to see anything like this. Let's try it over on positive. Yeah, and we get nothing. So without that momentary switch to energize the missing solenoid, you know, this blue wire isn't going to do a whole lot. And lastly, let's check the horn. So we're connected to positive. If we touch a ground, that light turns on. And we'll just rotate over here. Get no light. I'm going to hit the horn button. Yeah. So that is the ground for the horn. And all we need to do is feed a source of voltage, likely from here to the horn. And I think we'll be in good shape. All right, so I think we're on the right path here. You know, all that testing we just did gave us a lot of good information. And at this point, I am pretty comfortable getting this thing wired up correctly so that the electrical system is fully functional, at least good enough to move on to the next step. All right, so I get this solenoid connected up. Definitely less than ideal. You know, I was kind of hoping that I could at least use the original mounting point, but you know, the form factor of this is not going to allow it. So the best I can do is probably use a zip tie to just kind of hold it a little bit out of the way. Anyway, we've got the lead going down to the dynamo connected. So now we need the feed from the battery. And we also need a power feed from here also to this wire right there. So I made up this little jumper right here, which theoretically will connect over. I guess now that I look at it, yeah, that's not going to fit. So we are going to need something with a bigger eyelet. So let's get that fixed. Yeah, definitely not ideal. This is basically 12 volts. That's pretty exposed. So I'm not liking that too much. But I also don't want to modify the OEM harness. So Let me see if I can find, something like this to help protect that bullet connector. I'm going to use this wire to run over to the battery. It's definitely too long and maybe a little bit overkill on gauge, so we're going to have to make some adjustments there when we get the correct solenoid installed. But until we have that solenoid, it's kind of hard to cut this stuff down to the final size. So I think that's going to be pretty good. Once this is connected to the battery, we're going to have a full-time positive on this post, which feeds up into this wire, which is switched by the ignition to turn on the coil and the rest of the bike. And that wire likely is also going to be used for charging the battery. And of course, when we energize the solenoid, that'll connect these two posts and crank the engine. So we don't have the switch yet, so we're going to have to leave that negative post empty. But I am going to add the positive, which is connected to the ignition. So when that switch is turned on, the brown wire is energized. And once we ground out the other post, the engine should crank. And this wire, it's also split so that one lead gets the positive when the ignition's turned on, and that also feeds positive down to the horn, which normally won't do anything until you hit the switch. And that grounds out the horn and should make a sound. Okay, so the horn is connected. We can snug this up. And let's connect the battery. I think we'll be good for the most part. And to crank the engine, we're just going to need to ground out this post just for a second till the engine starts. And we should be up and running. And I'm going to swap out this negative wire as well. We're missing an end. The gauge is also pretty thin compared to the positive that I'm using. It might be overkill, so we might switch back at some point. But let's try the heavier gauge first. And if for some reason we can't get that to fit, we can always go back to the lighter gauge. Actually, I'm going to pull this battery box out if I can. It is missing the battery strap, and that was something I pre-ordered along with the battery. And kind of had trouble getting the strap. So, I placed the order from a seller in Germany, and the order was canceled due to issues with the tariffs and shipping. And I kind of made a post on my community tab just complaining about the state of things, wasn't really expecting so many people who live in Germany to reach out and offer to ship me the strap that I was trying to get. So a few of you reached out, so I thank you all for that. And actually a subscriber, Alex, ended up just buying it and sending it our way. So thank you, Alex, for that. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Huh. Can't actually slide that out without taking a lot of stuff apart. So yeah, let's see if we can get the battery strap in there. Might be a little bit tricky, but you know, given that this isn't really free to come out, yeah, I think that might be the way to go here. And this is the strap right here. So this is new old stock. You can't really get it anywhere, but there are a couple places that still have it. So this has to go through the slot down here on the far side, and then you use a cotter pin to keep that from pulling back out. So I've got a new battery, all charged up. So for better or worse, we've got this wiring harness kind of scabbed together, and it should be more or less functional. So let's give it a quick test. You know, if we turn the switch to the run position, we see that that neutral light turns on, so that is working fine. And if we turn it one more, we get the headlight as well as the tail light. So that is working just fine. With it off, the horn should not work. But in the run position, horn works just fine. And as far as the cranking goes, you know, all we need to do is ground out this starter relay. And right now I have the switch in the off position, so the engine actually shouldn't crank like that, which it doesn't. But if we put it into run, the engine should crank and the plug will spark. So that is perfect. All right, so this carb looks pretty easy to get to. I guess the thing I'm not completely sure of is the airbox. You know, this is a hard plastic connection into the carb. So likely we are going to have to pull the airbox off to get access to the carburetor. You know, either way though, I do want to get this cover off and at least see the condition of the air filter. Okay, got a filter, although it does need to be replaced. The foam, it is just falling apart. So we definitely don't want to leave that in when we go to test it. So we're going to have to get a new one of those ordered up. Okay, well, that solves that problem. So the whole thing just comes out as one piece, and I'm not sure if that's OEM or not, or at least it looks like there was some sort of a repair, potentially, at some point. Anyway, we now have access to the carb, so let's get the slide out. And there's really not much more holding it on. We've already disconnected the fuel line, just 2 bolts right there, and the carb should come right off. All right, so I don't think this is going to be too terribly bad. We do have a couple screws here on the outside. This first one is the idle set speed. So we'll just take that out and we can reset that, once we get the bike running. And we have another screw right there, which I assume is an air screw, although I don't see a spring on it, so it might potentially just be a fixed jet. No, it's actually, I think, an air screw. So right now, it's half one, 1.5. Yeah, 1.5 turns out. Yeah, that was an air screw. You can tell because the fuel screw has a pointy tip and the air screw, it is rounded. So externally, I think that's pretty much it. So let's see if we can get these screws off here on the bottom, just holding on the bowl. All right, that one was pretty loose. So that's a good sign. 3 more to go. Yeah, looks pretty good. Just some oil, the fuel evaporated, but the condition's very good. I don't see any corrosion. So, that 2-stroke oil does a very good job of preserving these carburetors. So let's try to get that needle out. It is free. It looks to be good. All right, so we've got a pilot jet down there as well as the main jet. So let's see if those come out. Yep, pilot jet's coming. Okay, and the main jet. Okay, and that is pretty much it. So the carb is actually in very, very good condition. Nothing appears to be clogged. Yep, main jet is clear. And the pilot jet also clear. So I think the carb would have run fine, with the exception of maybe the oil. It's a bit excessive. Anyway, we'll give this a quick bath anyway in the ultrasonic while we have it apart, but this carb should definitely run that engine pretty well. Yeah, I was just cleaning stuff up and I pulled out what I thought was the drain bolt, but this is actually the fuel pickup in the main jet. Now, I did double check this. It is not clogged, but the fuel actually has to go through that passage and the main jet to get to this piece we pulled off right here. So this is just a passage that connects right down in there and then brings the fuel up through the body of the carburetor. So, I haven't seen a setup like that before. I thought it was pretty interesting. That actually means you can pull out the main jet without actually opening up the carb. So that is a fantastic idea. I wish more were like that. So I guess the one consequence of having the main jet down here is that this piece here needs to form a good seal. And the O-ring that's on there right now, it is not forming a good seal at all. It's actually pretty loose, and this is petrified. It actually feels like a piece of plastic. So I would say for sure this O-ring needs to be replaced. I guess the question is, do I have one on hand that'll work? That I am not sure of. So I'm going to take a look, see what I can come up with. So I have some that are close. I don't think it's quite the right size, but the way I see it, we don't have much of a choice. We either need to order one up or get this replaced. It's not forming a seal, and it's actually cracked right in half. Right there. I don't know if you can see that, but yeah, this one is done. So it has to be replaced. The question is, do I have one that's going to work? Let's find out. All right, that seems to be a pretty good fit, at least the inner diameter of that O-ring. Now, this is kind of a thinner O-ring than the one we pulled off. So that is not ideal, but if the outer diameter makes a good seal, then it should be good enough. And unfortunately, it does not. So yeah, until we get this replaced, we can't use this carburetor. So we are going to have to order a new one of these up. And I guess while we're at it, we'll get one for the seat as well. This seat, it is removable. It also has an O-ring, and likely it's in the same condition as the one we already pulled out. So yeah, we're not going to be able to test the engine today, but we'll still get the carb cleaned up, and we're going to have to wait for the part we need. Carb cleaned up pretty well, and I think we'll run the engine pretty well. But we do need that O-ring. So I did go online and I found a new old stock O-ring for this carburetor. So, I think, we'll be in business once it arrives, but it's going to set us back a few days. So, we can't get this fully back together, but we'll get it back together as far as we can. And when the O-ring shows up, we'll finish it up. All right, so we set that air screw at 1.5 turns. The pilot jet can go back in, as well as the main jet. Okay, and that is it. So we'll give it a few days. We'll finish this up, get it back on the bike, and go for the first start. So while we wait for that O-ring to show up, there's another problem I noticed we need to fix. Right now the bike's in neutral, the wheel rotates as it should, and if I put it in gear, it engages. All the gears seem to engage just fine. The problem is, if I hold the clutch down, like I am right now, it's fully depressed, we still can't rotate that wheel. So that tells me that the clutch plates are stuck to the friction discs, and potentially we could break it free, once the engine's up and running. But there's another way we can do it. It takes a few days, but we have a few days. So let's give that a try. So what we're gonna do is just zip tie this clutch in the down position. So this is going to take all the pressure off the clutch plates. And sometimes that's enough to free it up. But it does take a couple days. And the other thing we can do to help out is actually to overfill the crankcase with oil. That's going to bring the oil level up. The clutch basket's going to be deeper in that oil, which will help things out. And every once in a while, just rotate the engine, kick it over, and that'll turn the clutch basket so a different part is in the oil. And this works quite often, so I'm hoping that it will in this case. And if this doesn't work, we can always drive it around. That might free it up. And worst case scenario, we can just take off this side cover and free it up that way. But let's start with the easy thing. And see how we make out. So while we wait for that clutch to free up, I've been walking around the bike just looking for any other problems that we're going to need to fix. And I noticed that we do have a cable down here that doesn't belong. That is actually the cable for the tachometer. That should be connected to the engine. So out of curiosity, I did spin that cable with a drill, and the tachometer, it didn't move. So that, unfortunately, no longer works. So that was bypassed. Normally it should have been connected right here. And when looking at that, I noticed we have a few other things here that have been plugged off. Now, there is an oil pump, or at least there was, behind this cover. And connected to the throttle cable, there should be a second cable running down to the oil pump through that hole, but that has been plugged off, and the oil lines would normally enter right there, and that has also been plugged off. So the oil pump, whether it's there or not, it's been bypassed. So we're going to have to premix on this one. Yeah, 12 hours later, and it already did the trick. So we're still in gear, the clutch is pulled in, and I can now rotate the tire. So if I cut the zip tie, It's now turning the engine. Perfect. All right, it's been a few days, and I think we have all the parts we need to get this bike back up and running again. You know, starting with the O-ring for the carburetor. So hopefully that will solve our problem. You know, while I was at it, I ordered the O-ring that makes the seal, you know, between the carb and the engine. So we'll get both of those replaced. I've got a used OEM starter solenoid, so hopefully that works. We will test that. We have a starter switch, a new throttle cable, and a new filter. Now, I was hoping to get the OEM part, but that part is long since discontinued and nothing aftermarket available. So we're going to have to stick with a pod filter. This one's a little different, so hopefully we can make it work. So let's start with the most important part here, the O-ring. Now, this was supposed to be new old stock. The picture showed it, I think, with a OEM Yamaha bag. And of course, the part I received did not have that bag, so I don't know what this is exactly, but you know, as long as it fits and I don't break it putting it on, we should be good. Let's see how that fits. Yeah, that's going to make a nice seal. So I think we're in business here. I'm actually going to take this back off because to get a wrench on the flats here, you know, all my wrenches, they are wider than the space we have, and it's going to damage the O-ring. So there was this brass washer right here. We'll get that screwed in. Snug this down. And then we'll add the O-ring back. Okay, that is good. Drop the needle back in. And the float doesn't hook onto the needle, it just pushes it closed. So it sits on top like that. Okay, that looks good. We definitely need a new one of these. You know, this I thought was a flat washer, and it's not. It used to be round, like that one right there. So this part is actually the OEM part. So let's pick that out, clean it up a bit, and get the new part installed. That is a pretty big improvement. The seal that was on there was in pretty bad shape and likely wasn't making a good seal on the engine side of things. So with this new seal in place, as well as the internal one on the carb, you know, I would say this has a good chance of running the bike pretty well. So, you know, I am tempted to bolt it on right now and try it out. But I'm thinking, you know, before we put the carb on, it's going to be easier to sort out some of these other issues. So let's get those sorted, and then we'll get the carb on and try it out. So let's make sure the solenoid is good before getting it installed on the bike. You know, being that it's a used part, it may very well not work. So I've got the multimeter hooked up to these posts right here just to measure the resistance. And what I'm going to do is energize the solenoid. The red lead is connected right there. And we're going to use the other lead connected to the screwdriver to energize the solenoid. And what we want to see is that we get a nice low connection, probably around 0.1 ohms. And yeah, we're at 0.1. So this solenoid is good. So let's get it installed on the bike. So I've got the battery disconnected and all these connections are loosened up. So I'm just going to get this temporary solenoid out of the way. We'll get the correct one mounted in its place. And then we'll probably adjust the wire length a little bit running to the battery. It's a little long right now, so we'll cut that to size and run the wires up to the handlebar for the switch. And we need to get the ground wire disconnected. This is where the solenoid is supposed to mount. So it's supposed to mount like that, which should be fine. This green wire should reach to the terminal here on the far side. And the hot wire would go in here, although the clutch wire is kind of in the way. So I think I need to cut that zip tie or maybe slide it back so we can get a little bit more room. And yeah, I guess the one thing I don't like about this is that, you know, to tuck this in under the tank, this terminal is going to get pretty close to the frame. So I might add some more shrink tubing to it, but at this point I'm not sure I can without adding a new terminal, like cutting this one off, which, you know, I'm going to shorten this wire anyway, so I think we might do that. Huh. Even Yamaha put this sleeve down a little bit too low. It's just pinching, you know, when you go to tighten it up. So yeah, it looks like I might actually be able to slide this down. No, I think we need to cut that. we still have a few wires here. We have two on the solenoid, a brown and a blue. The brown should connect to this one right here, which is keyed 12 volts for the coil. So we'll connect that up. And the blue wire, I mean, technically it should get connected right here, but we don't have the switch on the handlebar. So this wire isn't going to do anything right now. So we did get a new switch, not the OEM part, it's discontinued. And that does have two wires that'll come down here. So one will connect to ground and the other one to the blue wire on the solenoid. So let's get that connected now. You know, the horn was also picking up power from the brown wire, the keyed ignition switch. So we could splice into that brown wire, but I'm thinking it might just be best to, you know, extend this wire down to the battery. You know, it doesn't have to be keyed to the ignition. All right, so this is the switch right here that I ordered up. It's an okay part, obviously not OEM, but it's at least made out of aluminum, which is better than most I saw. So I was gonna mount it right there, or potentially slide the brake down and squeeze it in there. You know, I think both would be a good spot, and likely where the OEM switch was. The one problem though is that the wire harness is a little bit too short, so we'd have to lengthen the wires to put it up here. But I'm thinking, you know, I'm not sure how useful this electric start's going to be. You know, now that the plugs are back in, I did crank the engine over with the electric start, and it's kind of slow. So I don't think it would start a cold bike, but given that we have electric start, we have the solenoid, I would like to enable it, and potentially it would start, you know, a warm engine. So instead, I'm just going to put it down here. Probably not the OEM spot, but that way we don't have to modify the harness. And ideally, this would be removed at some point anyway and replaced with the right parts. So this is likely temporary until we can find something better. So even with the switch mounted where we mounted it, you know, we're just barely going to make this connection here. And it's actually a pretty loose connection at that. Yeah, it doesn't grip at all. So let me try another bullet connector. I'm not sure if the problem was this side or potentially, you know, the connector that came on that switch. And the problem is not on the Yamaha side, it's with the aftermarket part. So we're going to have to cut this back a little bit, and that could be a problem. Yeah, very good connection here. Okay, that one's in. A little tight, but I think it'll be okay. So the last one, we need to add a ring terminal. That's just going to be a ground. And when you hit the button, it'll pass the ground down to the solenoid, causing it to energize. cut this one back. And we don't need the protective sleeve. This is just going to be a ground signal. And yeah, I mean, picking up ground from something else isn't going to hurt it because the switch won't be depressed. So nothing will be passed down to the coil. All right, so I went ahead and finished up the wiring. So everything is reconnected to the battery. We have a dedicated wire to the horn. So regardless of the position of the switch, we're going to have the horn. If we put this in the on position, we get the neutral light. Headlight still works. And the start switch turns the engine over, although a bit slow. And if we turn the ignition off, we get no crank. So the wiring, I think, is done. So next, let's get the throttle cable replaced, which might be a challenge. That screw right there looks a little bit stripped out. Okay, so I did have to take the slide off the cable on the other end just to be able to pull this out. And usually there'd be a cable on each side of this, but since we have the oil pump deleted, we only have this on one side. So we need to get this freed up, and now this cable is good to come out. All right, so we get the new cable connected like that. All right, so the cable's in. Now for the fun part. Okay, that actually wasn't too bad. So the plate is in. Now we just need the spring to hold it in place, like that. And this part is good. All right, so let's get the carb reinstalled. And the needle isn't quite lined up. There we go. Okay, that is good. So we'll get one of the bolts in, or at least started. Carb is slotted, so we can just kind of slide that in place. All right, so we'll get this boot reinstalled. I'm cautiously optimistic. You know, ideally it should be replaced. There's a lot of cracks going around, but I have not been able to locate this part. So we're gonna have to make do with what we have. And speaking of making do, you know, the filter I couldn't find. And actually this plate right here, this is the plate on the OEM filter that is discontinued. So someone took this off a used filter, you know, welded on this piece right here so that we could attach a pod filter. You know, I wouldn't say it's ideal, but it's what we have to work with. So let's try to get this reinstalled. We'll get the pod filter installed and hopefully we'll be good to go. And yeah, it's going to be a tight fit, but I think it'll go. All right, so the tank, we still need to clean it up. For now, we're just going to run it on a little bit of test fuel. So let's fill it up, see if the needle and seat are working. And it's taking a lot of fuel, so it may not be working. I take that back. Needle and seat shut off. The fuel is full pretty much right to the top. So let's kick it over and see what we get. And I almost forgot, we are still overfilled with oil from when we freed up the clutch. So I'm going to bring that level down and then we'll be ready for the first start. Looks pretty good. Maybe a touch over full still. But that's fine. We're close enough, at least for a test. And once we get a little bit of heat in the engine, we're going to change the oil anyway. All right, so let's give this a try. I guess the question is it going to start? And if so, how many kicks? I'm going to go with 7. So we get the ignition on, choke on. And make sure the throttle isn't stuck. Still slow to return, but it at least returns. So we should be in idle. 3. All right, I think we're looking pretty good on this bike. You know, I was a little concerned initially when I saw the state of the wiring, but given the way the engine just ran, I think we are good to go because it started fourth kick. The engine sounded really good and I had no issues revving it out. So the carburetor and the engine, I think, are good to go. Really, the only adjustment I had to make was just the idle speed. You know, I had to bring that up just a little bit. And like that, it had no issues idling, nice and steady. And I guess the only thing of concern might be the amount of smoke that was coming out of the exhaust. It actually blew quite a bit of oil onto the lift and the floor. And we also have a puddle right here below where the exhaust connects to the engine head. So yeah, I mean, potentially we have a bad seal. And maybe that's transmission oil making its way into the crankcase. But I think, you know, more likely that was just some oil, you know, left in the bottom of the crankcase that needs to burn off. So, you know, we need to run this a little bit longer to know for sure. So, you know, I think we're at the point where we can get this fully back together. But before I do that, you know, I do want to test the charging system because the ignition needs a good battery. And in order to keep that battery good, that battery needs to be charging. So let's get a multimeter on there, get the engine restarted, and just make sure the battery is charging. All right, so we've got the multimeter connected. Right now we're at 12.45 volts. And if I turn the ignition on, that voltage is going to drop to about 12.11. Actually, it's 12.12. So let's kick it over a few times, see if that number goes up. So unfortunately, charging system does not seem to be working. And if we're lucky, it's just a bad fuse right there. So let's test that real quick. See if that's any good. And I can tell just from looking at it visually, it does not look to be bad. And yeah, we do have a connection through there of about 0.2 ohms. So that is not the issue. So I've been looking around trying to find any issues with the wiring, and I may have found one. Right here, that is the voltage regulator, and those are the wires coming from it. And if you look at the harness, you can tell just by the way that it is that it's not plugged in fully. So if we push that in like that, potentially that'll fix the issue. So let's get the bike restarted, see if it's any better. All right, same tests. Hopefully a different result. Ignition's on. We're at 12.56 volts. I was really hoping it would be as easy as plugging this in. But now that it's plugged in, we still have no charging of the battery. So, there's a few things it could be. Definitely a wiring issue. We could have an issue with the regulator or potentially down in the generator side of things. There is a set of brushes and some other components down here. So I think we should start there. Let's see if the generator is making any power. And based on that, we'll go from there. So I'm going to get this shifter out of the way. Don't think the cover is going to come off with it installed. So nothing obvious. We have the points and condenser here for the ignition system, and these are the wires here. The small ones running up to the regulator, and this big one down here. This is the one that turns the bike over. So the fact that the bike turns over slow with the electric start might be a sign of, kind of the issue going on here. Now there is a smell, like an electrical smell. So yeah, there's that. Definitely not a good sign. The white one, I believe, is the main output. So I'm going to attach a lead to that. And we'll also attach a lead to ground. And just restart the engine. We'll see if we have any voltage out from the generator. So we basically were getting nothing out, maybe a volt at best. So we need to do some more testing. For this, I'm going to use the service manual. And it says to remove the white and the green wires. So we'll start by doing that. And basically, I think what we're doing here is we're isolating the generator from the regulator, because the regulator basically grounds out the charging system when the voltage gets too high. So, the fact that we weren't getting voltage doesn't necessarily indicate a problem with the generator. It could still be a problem with the regulator. And what we need to do now is to ground terminal F, which is the green wire, to M. And they don't make it very clear what M is, but I believe M is this green wire right here. So I'm going to get this a little bit more out of the way so we don't get caught up in the points. And what we want to do is connect a lead from the multimeter again to the output. In this case, not the white wire, but the white terminal. And I think it's actually not the green wire that we should be grounding out. It should be the actual terminal. And the black lead of the multimeter just to any source of ground. So I'm going to rotate the engine slowly. I'm still a bit concerned that this wire is too close. I think it'll be okay. So let's get the engine restarted. So pretty much the same result, and I may have made a mistake here. I grounded out this terminal to the green wire, which is, according to the diagram, wire M, which is where they say to ground it out to. But they also say the wire is black, and that's clearly not black. So There is a black wire right here, and that is essentially just engine ground. So we could connect it there, but I'm thinking we can connect it really anywhere. And I'll get the lead back on the main output. We'll connect that to the multimeter as well as a ground wire. And let's try this again just to be sure that we have no output. So we didn't do any better this time now that we had things jumpered out what I believe was the correct way. So I'm going to start isolating a few things. There are a total of 4 brushes here. The one here on the top left, it's connected right to this plate, so most likely that is a negative brush, and we have another one down here. So we'll get those disconnected as well as the positive brushes. Got one right here. And on this screw, there are 2 wires. So one of them is a brush wire, and the other one just looks like a jumper. It's this brown wire right here that runs kind of underneath these terminals right to here, where we have another brush wire. And it looks like we also have a black wire connected. So there's 3 wires on this terminal. So that is the brush wire, black wire, and this right here, the bottom one, that is the jumper that connects over to here. So like that, we have the 4 brushes isolated, and I'm thinking we should go a bit further and actually isolate, the wire harness completely from the generator. So we need to disconnect the green wire, set that aside, and the orange wire. And we probably need to disconnect the points as well. It looks like we have a connection right here and a couple other connections as well. So I'm going to take a second and just study all these other connections. I want to make sure we're completely isolated before we do any testing here. We do have a few more connections here. So I'm going to remove this one, which comes from the points. This was doubled up with the orange wire. So we'll just make sure it's off the terminal. And then it looks like we have maybe 2 wires going to the field. I see one right here that goes in behind here. And it looks like a thick wire right there. So let's see if we can get that one off. And no, not really. So I'm not sure if that's a wire. It does look like one though. All right, so that is no longer making contact. And we've got, it looks like one more right there. All right, so we've got the brushes all disconnected. They are isolated, and all the wires disconnected from this wire block. So if I test for continuity between the different lugs, we should not have any. And we don't. And no fault to ground. So if we check the brushes to ground, they also should be isolated. And that one is not. So yeah, I think we have a problem here. This brush also has a ground connection. Let's check that one. Yep, 3 of them do. And how about the last one? Yeah. So something's definitely wrong. You know, these are disconnected. You know, the only thing the brush should be touching is the commutator, and then that's going right into the rotor. And those wires should be protected with varnish, but it would appear that we have a ground fault pretty much across the board. All right, so let's keep digging. You know, if we're really lucky, it's a failed brush that is shorting the commutator out. So I'm just pulling the spring away, and like that, we should be able to slide the brush out. Let's see if we still have a ground fault. And we do. So let's pull the next brush. Let's see, do we still have a ground fault? We do. And only one brush left. So I'm starting to think that we just have a bad generator here. The brushes, they don't look bad. You know, I was expecting maybe a little bit more wear, but all of them are above the wear line. And the protection on the braided wire seems to be mostly intact. I'd say this one might be the worst of the bunch. But even so, after we pulled that one out, we still had a ground fault. So now that all the brushes are out, let's do another test from ground directly to the commutator. You can just get a glimpse of it right there. So let's see if the fault still exists. And no ground fault. And the probe is connected properly. So yeah, maybe it is a bad brush. Let's just double check. Yeah, no ground fault to speak of. Let's touch the brush holder. And actually the brush holder has a ground fault. So that's actually good news. It means the rotor might actually be good. All right, so I've been looking this over, trying to kind of make heads or tails as far as where the ground fault is. Initially, I was thinking it was on the commutator, but after probing directly with the brushes removed, that does not seem to be the case. So I've been probing the brush holders, and what I noticed is something that actually kind of makes sense, and we can kind of dismiss the ground fault, I think. If you look, there's two brush holders on both sides. And on this side, the negative holder's on the bottom, and if I probe that, we get a ground fault. And that kind of makes sense. You don't need to insulate it from ground because that brush connects right there to ground. But if you look at the upper brush holder, there is this yellow coating underneath it, and that is insulation. So if I probe the positive brush holder, we do not get a ground fault. And it's like that on the other side. The negative has the ground fault, the positive does not. So, when we had all the brushes installed, we had ground faults all the way around. But what must have been happening is that the negative brush, through the commutator must have been connecting to a positive brush. And that's how we got what we got. So the good news is I don't think we have a ground fault on the armature. And one last test here. I reinstalled one of the positive brushes. And like that, we should not have a connection to ground. So let's test that. And we don't. So on the surface, that appears good. But what I'm noticing is that if I touch any commutator bar, I get a connection. It doesn't matter which one I touch. So there might still be a failure, but from what I can see, the commutator is quite dirty. So there could also be conductive paths, and maybe we just need to clean it out. So let me just touch some of the bars to show you what I'm talking about. So I just picked a random one. We got a connection. Let's try one on the other side. Yeah, and same thing. So, I've done this a few times, and pretty much every commutator bar I touch, we get a connection from this brush. So as much as I hate to do it, I might take this apart further, which means basically removing the ignition and pulling this whole thing out. Now to do that, probably the easiest way would be to pull this cover first, and then there's just two screws holding it in place. And I believe this will slide right out. But before we do that, we do need to remove this bolt. So we need to peel off this electrical tape and kind of separate the wire harness from the generator. And this mess here is what I'm talking about. So if I probe on these commutators, every single one of them is connected to the other. So we don't have a fault, a ground fault, but all of these are a problem. So let's clean that up a bit with Scotch-Brite. I think we're going to have to clean out in between as well. And with any luck, we'll get this back in good order. And actually, Yamaha says you can use sandpaper on this as well. And if it's really bad, you can even put it in a lathe. So we still need to do more cleaning, but let's see if that did anything at all. And no, nothing. So I've probably spent too much time on this, and I've cleaned it up just about as much as I can. And despite that, everything is still shorted out. So I think that the armature is bad. But on the positive side, I believe the field coils are good. So we have 4 wires coming out of the field coil, which are right up here. So if I probe one of them and check for ground faults, there are none. So that is good. And as far as the resistance goes, I don't know what this should be, but we do get a value. So when measuring between the big lugs, we get about an ohm. And on these smaller ones, we get 4.5 ohms. So, I don't know if that's good or not, but I don't think it's bad. The issue here, I think, is a bad armature. And as you can imagine, being a 1970 bike, you can't buy this new. There are some on eBay, and none of them look as nice as this one. But it's not all about looks. The multimeter doesn't lie. This is 100% bad. So I am going to order one up, a used one, and hopefully that one tests well. But before I do that, I want to make sure I can remove this from the engine. So let's try to do that now. And assuming it comes off, then we'll order a new one. So this is the only tool I own that might work. And I'm not giving it very good odds because the jaws don't close any more than that. So if this doesn't work, I'm going to have to buy some more tools. All right, so the puller is not working too well. So instead, I'm going to push this off the crankshaft using this rod, which is larger in diameter than the bolt that threads into the crankshaft. So that is important. If it's the same size or smaller, then you're going to push in and destroy the threads. But in this case, I'm hoping that we just push against the crankshaft without actually causing any damage. So we'll thread this in. And I was hoping it would go in a little bit more than that. So I'm going to have to cut that a little bit shorter because I want to engage, I would say, at least half the threads before trying to push this off. All right, let's try this out. Trimmed about 1/4 inch off of it. Perfect. And the threads are undamaged. And we do have a little bit of oil here. So we should replace this seal too while we're here. So at this point, I'm not convinced that the armature was bad. Some of the testing I just did was actually flawed. We'll get into that in a minute. So I want to do more testing on the field windings and the armature up on the bench. and then we'll make a decision as to what we need to order. So I'm going to retest the field windings. There are two different ones. One is for charging and one is for cranking the engine. So since we're not charging, we'll start with that one. It should be 4.8 ohms at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which is actually a little cooler in here. But you can see we're in the ballpark. 4.62 seems to be good. And if we check it for ground faults, there are none. So the charge field winding appears to be good. The other winding, it's a lower resistance. According to the manual, 0.0268. So we'll test that. Yeah, we're close. Yeah, so we're at 0.027. So that does appear in spec and no ground fault. So I think the field windings are good. You know, we tested the positive brush holders. There's no faults to ground there. So I can't see anything wrong with this assembly. So let's move this out of the way. And we can double check the armature with this meter, which is a little bit better than the other one. Again, we'll check for ground faults. This is actually the only thing listed in the service manual to do besides cleaning the commutator bars, and there is no ground fault. So that seems to be good. Obviously, the commutator bars were in very bad shape, very dirty, and the spacing in between was not good either. So, you know, that theoretically fixed this. You know, to know for sure, really this needs to be put on a growler, which I don't have. And the testing I did earlier was flawed in that it is normal that every one of these commutator bars has a connection pretty much to every other. What changes here is that as this rotates, the way the current flows through here changes based on where the brushes are touching. So really the only valid test we can do is the 180 test, where you test the commutator bars at 180 degrees away from each other. And you note that reading, in this case 0.008, and then you check the next set. Should be about the same. So in this case 0.009, 0.008, and so on and so forth. So I've already done that, and everything came in consistent. There's no shorts, no open circuits, no readings that are materially different than 0.008 and 0.009. So from that point of view, we're looking pretty good. And we can also check from adjacent commutator bars. So same idea, you just want to note what the resistance is, 0.016, move to the next set, you should see about the same, move to the next set, and so on and so forth. So I've gone all the way around, everything is consistent, there's no short circuits, nothing's open, so the armature I think is good. So I'm not going to order a new one of these up. Instead, I'm just going to get the oil seal, a new set of brushes, and I'm willing to bet this will work. You know, of course, we could have issues in the voltage regulator, but you know, the testing we did earlier essentially bypassed the regulator, where we ground out the negative wire on the field right to ground. This should have self-excited. So maybe residual magnetism is an issue as well. So if it still doesn't power up, we can try flashing the field. But I'm willing to bet this is still good. All right, so it's actually been 2 weeks. It took a lot longer than I thought to get the seal and the brushes. So I've got the bike back on the lift. Let's get the new seal installed and then put this thing back together and see if we can generate any power. So let's just double check that the new seal is gonna fit. So we get a measurement here of the shaft diameter, and it looks like about 25.3 millimeters. So if we check the new seal, yeah, 25.3, so that looks good. And the outer diameter, I think it's supposed to be 40. And yeah, we're at about 40.6. And the new seal is 40. So yeah, I think we'll be okay. So let's pull that seal out. So the old seal, it is still flexible, which is pretty impressive for the age of this machine. I'm not sure if it's ever been changed. Regardless, though, we have a new one, and we're here. So I'm going to pack this with a bit of grease. There is actually a spring in here, which I don't want falling out when we install this. Otherwise, the seal is not going to work right. So the old seal, I think it was driven in maybe a little bit too deep. Yeah, I don't want it actually touching the ball bearing, but we don't want it to fall out either. So right there, we're pretty flush. I'm going to drive it in just a little bit deeper and call that good. All right, we'll get the armature back in. It is keyed, so it only goes on one way. And then we'll get the stator on. It is slotted right there, and there's actually an alignment pin. All right, so we get this piece back on. Yamaha calls it a governor, but I think it is for spark advance. And it is keyed. So it only goes on one way. And theoretically, the timing should still be good. So one thing I've noticed on the 1971 service manual is that it describes pretty much everything in detail as far as how to take it apart, but it doesn't tell you how to put it back together. You know, a good example is the oil seal as far as how deep it should go. Also, the only torque specs in the manual are for the head bolts. But for something like this, they don't list a torque value. So, you know, this is a 7mm bolt, and a conservative number is about 17 Newton meters, or 150 inch-pounds. So that's what I'm going to go to, and hopefully don't regret it. There we go. So we get the brushes in next, and just for comparison, you can see the size difference between the new one on the left and the old one on the right. So change of plan. You know, I was getting ready to install these, and I'm noticing a lot of the protective coating here is just falling off. So although these are unused brushes like this, it is definitely going to short out. So we're going to have to go back to the old ones. So I'm not going to connect up most of these wires, but the orange one is critical. That is the connection to the points. And without that, the bike's not going to run. So we'll get that installed. And I think we can leave the heavy gauge green wire disconnected. That's just to crank the engine. And we're going to do a test like we did before, where we run the engine, we ground out the negative on the field, and then we monitor the output. So we do still have a few wires here to connect, and the rest of these I think can stay where they are. And the final connection we need to make here is actually this positive brush to this terminal. And this is the same terminal that's jumpered over to the other positive brush. You can just maybe see the wire right there. We also have two wires from the field. These are all positive leads from the field and the positive connections from the brushes. So we have to add this one, and then I think we'll be ready to start it and see if we get any output. Okay, we are all fueled up. It is the moment of truth. We've got everything connected kind of like we did way back in the beginning. We're grounding out the negative on the charge field winding right to the case. We also have the positive output of the generator connected to the multimeter as well as a ground wire. So we'll get the engine started. Without the regulator, the voltage will be high at idle, and you don't want to rev the engine because it's going to spike really high and potentially could damage something. So if we do get output according to the multimeter, I'm also going to touch the light positive connection to the positive output and just see that it can support a load. So let's get the engine started, and hopefully it was worth it. All right, let's give this a try. We'll turn the ignition on. And I can't see the multimeter, but if the engine's idling correct and the generator is actually working, we should see around 14 volts DC out. So here goes nothing. Nice. I had to shut things down a little bit prematurely because this red clip started to move and I didn't want it to get caught up in things. That said though, I've got the information I need. The generator, it is working now. At idle, we were producing about 14 to 15 volts and we had no issues at all powering a load. So, I think we're good to go. Likely the issue was just the dirty commutator bars. And I'm kind of wondering at this point if the electric start is going to work better because as it was before, it was not cranking the engine very fast. So I'm going to get all these wires reconnected. We'll test the electric start, see if there's any improvement there. And we'll also check out the charge voltage to the battery to see if the regulator is able to control the output from the generator. All right, so we'll get this main connection up for the electric start and secure it. And we'll do the same for the lead running to the voltage regulator. And I might loosen this one up a little bit too. It's kind of in the way a bit. And lastly, this is the lead that brings the power up to the voltage regulator. So this is actually connected to that. So this is essentially connecting it to the positive brushes and the positive leads coming out of the field windings. And that's it. So let's try cranking the engine. The ignition's on. Oh yeah. That's much faster. It's almost starting. Let me add a little bit of fuel to the carb. We'll try the electric start for real. All right, I've got the multimeter connected to the battery. We're starting at 12.52 volts. So I'm going to test the electric start, see if it can actually start the engine. And assuming it does, we'll keep an eye on what happens here. This regulator can only control voltage to an extent. If the voltage gets too low or too high, it disconnects the charging system from the battery. But there should be a sweet spot where we see this voltage increase. So we're not quite home free yet. Although the generator made power this time, the battery was not getting any of it. So there is an issue, I would say, with the wire running up to the regulator, or potentially the regulator itself, or maybe the output of the regulator. So let's take a look at that first. Let's probe on that red wire and see if there's any voltage coming out of the regulator. So there are definitely a couple issues here. This connector right here that we plugged in earlier, I tried to unplug it and a corner of that connector broke off. So, I think the wires are still connected properly, but that obviously could be an issue. The other one is this red wire right here that comes out of the regulator. That is the wire that should be charging the battery. And I thought originally this was part of the wire harness, but after pulling on it a bit, I can see someone just put some electrical tape on there. And the problem potentially is underneath. It's actually pretty wide. So I don't know if the wires are actually connected or just taped side by side. So let's get this tape off. And it's just breaking off. It's been on there for a while. So we get the tape off and get the multimeter connected to the red wire coming out of the regulator to see if we're getting any voltage. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that this wire, it is live, so we can't let it touch anything. Yeah, it is connected, although a little loose, but not super loose. All right, let's check the voltage real quick. The ground is connected to the engine, and if I touch a probe on battery positive, we should see battery voltage, which we do, 13.04 volts according to this meter. And we should see the same over here on this connector. And we don't. We actually see millivolts, and it's actually not dependent on whether I touch this or not. So that is interesting. We checked the fuse earlier. That seemed to be good. And actually, we do have voltage. So on the connector closest to you, we get 13.04. If we check on the connection over to the regulator, we get nothing. And actually nothing on this other wire coming down. So yeah, definitely a problem right there. Okay, so we're disconnected, and I'm going to test the regulator first. So keep an eye on the meter. I'm going to start the engine. Hopefully we see some output. Yeah, 14.97. So the regulator seems to work. The issue is a bad connection to the wire harness. So let's disconnect the battery. The positive, not so easy. We're going to short something out, but we can disconnect the negative from the frame. And with that disconnected, it doesn't matter if we accidentally short this out, because without this connected, there won't be a circuit. So I'm just going to clean this up with a Dremel. We'll get the surface nice and clean. I'm going to give this connector a little squeeze, make a tighter connection, because as it is right now, when it slides in, it's pretty loose. So that's part of the issue. I think the main issue is just some of the corrosion on this connector. Okay, that's a tight fit. So I'm going to get the probes back on there. We'll get the bike started and see if we're charging. All right, let's give this a try. We're starting out at 12.59 volts. Ignition is on. Let's crank the engine. So finally, we are now charging. The battery was getting voltage when the engine revved up, so the regulator is working, this connection's working, and really the whole system at this point is working as it should. So I'm going to take a second, just wrap this back up, get the covers on, get everything back on, and then we can take this thing out for the first ride. So let's get this old fuel out of the tank. And I believe the fuel valve is also clogged up. Ooh, that is pretty bad. I'm surprised the tank isn't more rusted out. All right, so there's no blockage from here into the tank. So if we do have one, maybe it's right there. More likely though, I'm thinking it's the filter. So let's just make sure this is clear. We'll get some new fuel line, a new fuel filter installed, get the tank back on the bike, add some fuel, and make sure we have flow from the tank. All right, got a new fuel line made up, as well as a new filter. So we have a gallon of fresh fuel in there. Let's try the valve. It's in the on position. We're already getting good flow out. And let's check reserve. And even better flow. So good. Let's get the fuel line connected. And at that point, we'll be just about ready. Get some fresh oil in here. And as I'm taking that dipstick out, I'm noticing we do have what looks to be a toolbox. Let's see if we have anything in here. Yeah, we do have some tools. So we got a ratchet, extension, and I don't know if I can reach it, but I think we also have a socket for changing the plug. So we're going to get both plugs replaced. I've already double checked the gap. They were a little big. Yamaha calls for 20 to 24,000, so I did close it up. Closer to 24. Well, it is an absolutely beautiful day out for a bike ride. So let's get the engine started and go for a ride. All right, so we got the fuel on. We'll probably give it a bit of choke. And we'll go for the electric start. Choke off. There we go. Let's try the clutch. Yep. Running pretty good. So I think we should take it out on the open road, venture a little bit, and hope we don't break down. About 30, probably about as fast as I want to go in this neighborhood. Brakes work well, both the front and the back. Definitely peppy. Well, for a 1971 bike, it runs really well. Not to mention it looks great. So I just put about 8 miles on it. It ran perfect. Yeah, I know the owner's going to be pretty excited to get this one back. This one he loves quite a bit, and he said it was not running well the last time he had it running. So, the main culprit I think was that bad O-ring and the carburetor. It would have been letting way too much fuel into the engine, just flooding it out. So now that the carb is cleaned and a new O-ring installed, the engine is running perfect. And of course the charging system, that was a bit of a surprise. So this bike, even when it was running well, likely would not have made it very far. But the charging system is fixed, the electric start is fixed, and really I would say this bike is mostly good to go. There is still a short list of things that I'd like to do to it to make it perfect, but given its age, it is a surprisingly short list. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.